Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, gentlemen, and happy Tuesday. Happy Tuesday.
Ooh, a little extra spring in that one.
Yeah, no, I don't. I went low and then realized that was probably not a good idea with the happy Tuesday.
And welcome to your Tuesday.
And welcome to Tuesday. Oh, so much to talk about today.
Well, starting off with this week, we had a holiday in the U.S., so the Memorial Day weekend was this weekend, so no one was working on Monday. Therefore, we had ample time to screw around over the weekend and think about things that we had seen or thought about over the build week last week. So last week was the Microsoft Build Conference that I was able to go to, which was an awesome opportunity. There was a lot of really different people for the conference. We'll get into some like final thoughts for build here just for a second. But before we do that, let's quickly talk about what's our main topic for today. Today, the main topic is the impact of this new thing called task flows. You may have seen it shown up here this month. It was probably about 2 weeks or so ago where you saw this new task flows thing show up inside your Power BI workspace. It's just on. I don't know if you can turn it off. I haven't seen anywhere you could.
I don't think so.
You now get this thing called task flows. So we're going to kind of talk through the impact of task flows, maybe how we will use them or what they mean for your organization. So just a new feature that's inside the workspaces. Sorry. Okay, that's our main topic for today. Let's do some more news and announcement type stuff. So jumping back into the end of build, I didn't get to attend many sessions at build, although there wasn't a ton for Power BI or Fabric in general. Most of it was a lot of other sessions around technical pieces. I did get the opportunity to go to this session around the Graphql, and conversely, it was around user-defined functions that are being built into Fabric. So a very interesting concept. So I got a lot of questions like, what is GraphQL? It's not Microsoft's graph. The word graphs is a bit misleading. GraphQL is an API layer that is allowing you to write JSON to write a query that sends it back to a backend, and then the backend can consume that data and then return results, but results are returned in JSON. So it's like an API interface, being able to do queries.
Is where in the platform is this going to be utilized? So because you said JSON as kind of the language, because
it's written. Your queries are written, and it's like an open protocol basically. Okay. So I've had a lot. This has been a lot of like consternation for people because I was talking to people like, well, what is it? How do I use it? Like, what's the point? The idea here is that this is a new API layer that you can communicate with, and it will let you go back and query data that's in your lakehouse, your SQL Analytics endpoint. I think there was something else that they mentioned in the video. It's actually now out. I'll go find the video on the Build Conference website. There was actually a video for that one that's out there as well. It's pretty interesting. It was really around, my opinion here is, it's really around people who want to interact with the data, but don't want to use the visual side of Power BI. Hey, I have all this information that's data inside the system. I want to go query it and get results out.
SQL?
Well, SQL's a bit different because
across the ecosystem.
Yeah. So, I mean, GraphQL is kind of like this generic way of querying information, and it's just a standard, right? So, technically, you could go to a lakehouse or to a SQL endpoint or to a warehouse or a SQL server. GraphQL pretty much is an interface. It's a medium, a layer between the two. So it's interesting you say that, Tommy, because SQL requires a bunch of other things in order to talk to the SQL server. So typically, if you're doing SQL, I think you need to have like packages or libraries or something to interpret the language of SQL and write it. So it's a protocol that can be sent back and forth. So yes, it's kind of like SQL, but no, it's like more like an API call.
Okay.
So is this just this was a session? This wasn't like the things I'm looking up. This has been around.
It's been around, but it's not. I think it's just now available to us in now Fabric. I think there's a general a preview that's going on right now.
That's the hook.
So the
Fabric.
Yeah, so GraphQL is an old thing. It's been in many other systems, but Fabric hasn't had it. And so I think this is now in preview or private preview.
APIs and Azure API management. Okay. So there's lots of words in certain areas, and it's new in certain areas.
I always love things with lots of words.
Yeah. That's cool, though.
It's interesting. So if you're building an application, like a web app, or you're building something that's like a website and you need to go get data out of your Fabric thing, GraphQL would probably be a very useful tool to developers. Developers, I think, will like GraphQL because they understand how to work with it. And it's an API. You authenticate, you send your query in, it comes back, and you can even manipulate data. So when you're looking at this thing, the GraphQL, you can actually use it to be able to edit records or rows of data with the standard, with the protocol. I was like, that's really interesting. This really feels like right back to me. Like this really feels like a whole complete solution where you could look at some data, make some changes, have GraphQL query back to the answers or the responses back. So this feels like Fabric is becoming a bit more read-write than what I've been used to seeing, which is Power BI, which is just purely read.
Yeah. I mean, this is still a very developer centric.
Very developer centric. Well, it's build, right? It's a developer conference.
Yep.
The other thing that was interesting was
clarifying for our business intelligence audience.
Yes, exactly. Good call.
There's nerds and geeks, and there's.
I actually had some people asking about how can I get a hold of this preview? If you go, I think about minute 25 into the video, and I'll put the video here directly inside the chat window for anyone who's interested in it. Around minute 25, there's actually a private preview. You can go fill out a form. They share that inside the video. If you're interested, you can go check it out. But there is this thing called user data functions, which are very interesting.
It's
not UDFs. It's a user data function.
UDF.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's technically what I think user defined function is what I typically use UDF for. But user data functions are things that can occur inside Fabric. So something needs to trigger a function, needs to be triggered, needs to do something. You can write Python, C#, I believe, inside this library. I liked it. I thought it was cool. I could see some use cases for it. But my first complaint was, I don't know how to write C# very well. I'm a little bit better at Python. So where's Copilot? Why doesn't Copilot write the functions for me? So that was one thing I was like missing. I wish it was in there.
In real time. I think I saw something like that in the real time event stream, but is that available kind of like the same way across the board, or is that only available in real time?
What do you mean? I'm not sure I understand.
There's a very similar type of language or tooling in the real-time intelligence, the event streams in Fabric.
Yes.
And I think that's the UDFs. But is
maybe
it across the board?
No, I think this is more about triggering things off of information that's coming through data parts. I mean, so the idea, I was thinking of it kind of like, it felt like a little bit like a store procedure.
Okay.
It felt like a store procedure that was, hey, when this occurs, run this little line of code, do some things, and then move on. So very, very short executions of commands. Not sure if I have solid use cases on it yet, but it felt like similar in that way as well.
I get it. The hook here is Fabric. The feature, right, is this new API GraphQL that we can connect to. Looks like supported limited data sources, right? Data warehouse, lakehouse, mirror databases.
Yep.
And then the features allows you to do certain functionality, feature changes, executions of the things on the things. Good summary.
Good summary.
Great summary. Things on the things and data passing through.
Yeah. Business users, you can totally skip this part of the conversation because this applies none to you. This is totally interesting things that are more of
cool,
just developers.
It's good to know. It's definitely good to know. Okay.
I
like it.
I think people were really, the business users that I was talking to were kind of like very struggling to say, where do I use this? Where does this apply? How is this useful? As an app developer, I could do a lot of app developments. I could say, oh yeah, this would make a lot of sense.
And as someone in between, these are rabbit holes just waiting to happen for no reason.
I did walk away from build thinking a lot of that. Like I kept thinking, wow, they're adding so many new things all over Fabric. It's hard to keep up with all the different things they have that are being presented. there's this new ISV solution thing that's coming out too. That's also
Platform
letting
or the
people build custom like Power BI apps essentially. So they're building like Fabric apps now, where you can build your own custom app inside the context of Fabric. So when you go to the
workloads.
yeah workloads,
Yeah,
it's
okay.
something like kind of like workloads thing. So it's interesting what they're doing there too. I could see some of the use cases, and I also want to explore that one as well. There's just a lot of things to kind of like keep your hands on right now. It's a bit crazy. Anyways, that was about it for the end of build. I enjoyed it. I had a lot of great conversations. I was shocked by the people who came by the REI booth. A lot of people were building apps and things. Not many people were doing heavily Power BI things, or if they were doing Power BI things, they weren't really doing Fabric things, which I guess is expected at a build conference, right? You have a lot more developers than you have people using Power BI centric things. So yeah, it's very interesting. I had a lot of great conversations, met a lot of really interesting people. A lot of companies are doing some really fun things. I did have a couple conversations around Snowflake, and they're like, people were asking like, well, we're using Snowflake. I'm like, yes, you are. They're like, well, what in Fabric does Snowflake things? And I kind of pointed out, okay, well, here, this is, if you're trying to serve data, you can put it here. If you're trying to store data, you can put it here. And the light bulbs were starting to click. We're like, I don't think we need Snowflake anymore. I think we could just use Fabric for everything. I'm like,
that is an option.
That is an option.
a whole trend. Yeah, it's not a click, but
there's a lot of things in there now. And there's and by the way, you have GraphQL. So they're like, oh yes, we need it now for sure.
That's what we've been waiting for.
That's what we've been waiting for. We were holding off until it had GraphQL, and then now we're good to go. We're ready to participate. Yeah, exactly. All right. Anyways, enough of the banter around build and things. Let's just jump into our main topic. So I'll kick it over here to Tommy. Maybe give us a quick overview, Tommy, of task flows, and we'll take it from there, and we'll kind of start talking about what does this mean for our business now.
I have a pretty dramatic introduction too.
Oh boy.
There comes a time on the Explicit Measures podcast when it's actually appropriate to use the following wording. We have found a game changer, and we've using this sparingly with, I think, the heavy weight that a game changer comes in. What Microsoft released with task flows really, to me, is that I think we would all agree on this. We have been dealing for the past 9 years, and especially the past year and a half with Fabric, with artifacts as line items, maybe a lineage view, but very hard to organize and understand, in so many words, the flow of our data, the flow of the functions and the applications in the sense that we are putting together. Microsoft, in really one swift UI change, can allow us to see in a workspace, so to speak, the start to finish of all the things in Fabric, not just a data set to a report, but my data flow going into my pipeline, going to my lakehouse, and the pathway. But furthermore, this is customizable for each person, for each workspace, This is not just a user-defined user or a user interface by default. I can share this. I can modify this and move this around, which will then affect the actual workloads and the dependencies. This we've never had before in a Power BI user interface. This is absolutely potentially the way that we're going to really by default start our workspaces and by default start our projects. So there's a lot of heavy sayings here, but I would feel I would be remiss to not say that this is absolutely qualifies as a game changer.
So point of clarification here, Tommy.
All right. Off the bat.
Yep, right off the bat. We just saying, if you're in the game changer realm, that's fine. But please, for future reference, before you start saying we here and we on the podcast say that this is a game changer, can you check with me first? Because I don't know if I'm going to throw my hat in that ring.
Okay.
Just precursor to the conversation. Just saying.
I'm very surprised to hear this.
Point of clarification. Of clarification. And whether I end there at the end of the episode, I don't know yet. But that's a hefty term. we here at this podcast may throw around once in a while.
We do not put it lightly.
Yeah.
I mean, I give this a whole 5 seconds worth of thought before I say something.
Game changer, yeah, sure. Throw it in
Sure.
there.
Yeah, this sounds good.
And you know what? And honestly, I completely understand that. There's a bit of an assumption. I'm actually shocked to hear that you are, I don't want to say on the fence, but not the immediate reaction that I think myself and I think a lot of people had on, wow, this does change how we're going to work. This does change how I approach.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think I want to unpack a bit more of the feature, right? So you described a little bit of high level in the feature there. I kind of want to so I liked your point, Tommy. I will say this: my first observation with Fabric has been there's too many things. Tommy and I were doing the Let's Learn Fabric, and within 3 or 4 or 5 episodes, we had so many artifacts inside the workspace that the list was scrolling. So just creating a bunch of stuff kind of got unwieldy very quickly.
Yeah,
in a workspace. So I think this is a great solution to be able to help users organize their content when the lineage view can't quite do it all, and you really need like multiple things. I've got a pipeline ingesting data. I've got multiple lake houses that are doing different things potentially. And then you have transformations happening either in data flows or notebooks that are changing the data from bronze to silver to gold. I mean, there's a lot of patterns I think that are occurring here. And I think when I heard about this at the Microsoft Fabric conference, the way it was described was from Amir was when you want to describe what your data is doing on a whiteboard, this is what you draw. This is the whiteboard diagram of all the things in your data flow or your pipeline or whatever, not an actual data flow, but like your data starts here and it ends there in reports. And so this is a good way of diagramming out these pieces. So I really liked that explanation of it's very colorful. It was very easy to add things. I do have some gripes around adding and removing artifacts from these different nuggets that are there. I think there's some bugs, not bugs. There's some missing features that I would like to see inside this pipeline, but we'll get there eventually. Let's get your initial impressions, Seth, on the feature.
No, I mean, from the Microsoft Docs, right? Like, what are the things that it streamlines? Like at first glance, it proposes that we can make sense visually out of a lot of listed items, and to me, fantastic, right? Because if anything, workspaces are, to your points, very cluttered. Very, like they're gonna instantly, like if we thought things were bad in just Power BI, now you're throwing in ETL, data storage, like all of these other artifacts, and it's going to be very challenging to like dissect what that means. So task flows being the visual representation of that, I think absolutely it solves a use case. As we talk about it further, I think there's room for improvement as far as feature development, I'm hoping, or severe limitations that may impact how I use it. But what is Microsoft trying to do, right? It is the whiteboard. It is a conversation. It's a place where not only can you start with like the task flow, I don't think they call them templates, but like the outlines, the industry standards for certain things like basic workflows of data, medallion architecture, Lambda, etc. So it's intended to streamline design to development. And I think it would do a good job at that. What was previously said is it's very easy to see because it's there and it's half your page. So you'll see it. You'll know what we're talking about.
Can't really help it.
It's supposed to, simplify navigation and manage the items in the workspace. I think it does that well in terms of, the structure that you're setting up, the task flow, and applying the different things within a workspace or creating net new within that. And then the other thing that really struck me is as far as like a solid use case scenario or one that is a benefit is its living documentation, right? Like it's a bit more than just the lineage. It allows you to add some manual stuff or, like I said, bucket categorize the different process flows and things within your workspace, and it clicking around, it's that live thing. So as a developer, you can just integrate with it versus having to manually write something down or manually update something when you're updating. And like documentation is everybody's bane of existence, for the most part, if you're a developer or a BI person, but it's also really critical when you're developing for other people or with other people. And this is that, I think, happy medium where it's not my documentation is all in my code and not available to anybody in the business. And it's not always in business documentation where I need to constantly go update.
To me, you're communicating the two areas where I would consider it really that game changer, or the game changing aspect of how we approach our projects and how we work on it. The first one is for the individual. If this was just a user interface after the fact, like lineage view, where, okay, I have to build everything, then I see the dependencies and I see the flow, that's cool. But to me, the whiteboard part is the first real true part of how I'm going to approach a project, or how someone would go across to approach their project as they're building. And when they actually modify the task flow, it's actually modifying the actual artifacts in there. That by itself is such a huge way, and probably going to change what we build and how many things we actually put together. Seth, to your point, the other side of this, where this is really maybe can make the argument more effective, is for teams, or kind of, I don't want to say copy paste, but going across departments. Like, hey, if you're trying to do XYZ, if your new marketing team is doing a lake house and you want to grab your data from APIs, we have templates. We have things that within our org that we can share. You can actually have real discussions on this, or arguments. I'm reading a book right now about the start of Xerox and their computer research lab. And one of the things that they did on a weekly basis were someone would come with a project, and basically everyone would critically go at it, kind of like whether it's a good idea or not. And to me, having a big project you're working on with the team to actually have that discussion, shoot, we can do this together. I go, Mike or Seth, I need to talk to you real quick. I'm working on something. What do you think of this? And to have then that interaction where it's like, let me figure out all your naming conventions. No, we have this here where there's almost like a unified language now, or a different language that we can all speak. To me, those two areas are really what sets this apart from, anything that Microsoft's really provided from a user interface point of view.
I think you're bringing up a lot of strong points, both Seth and Tommy. And one of the things I think I like here about this is, I was trying to think through, as you were describing the feature, Seth and Tommy, about, hey, here's some potential workloads or plans on what you would do with your data. Here, like, for example, one of the early instructions inside task flows is you're able to go here and say, here's what a medallion architecture may look like. I can't tell you the number of times I've drawn that exact same diagram in icons and tried to explain to people how this works. So, that exact same diagram already exists. I've been communicating it many, many times to clients and other companies. Like, this is what we want to build. So if you had not had these proposed ideas of architectures, it would have been very confusing for users to see what task flows actually is. So I think starting with this point of, here's something you may want to build, boom, here it is. That is extremely helpful for users to understand, what does this feature mean, and get your head around, oh, here's a medallion architecture. I already know what that is. Here's it represented in these colorful blocks. That helps me understand or communicate that to my team. So I think that was a really good move for them, because if you hadn't done that, it would have been very hard for people to absorb the idea.
What do you just in current feature, what's out there in preview, like what are your guys' first takes? Mike, you said I think, excuse me, we all agree, like the template's super helpful.
Yes.
Adding another task, modifying, like what is the experience thus far so far, for you guys?
Adding things seems to be pretty seamless, in my opinion. So going to a workspace, turn on a task flow, adding items into the tasks, not a big deal. Good luck trying to remove one of them. So I have found there is no way to uncheck or remove an item from a task flow. So let's just say you have a lake house and you accidentally tie the bronze layer lake house to the bronze. You're doing the example of the task flow for medallion architecture, right? There's 3 separate storage areas: bronze, silver, and gold. That's where you would put your lakehouse SQL Analytics endpoint, and you would put your default semantic model. Those would kind of live in each of those lakehouses because that's where they live. That's what they're attached to. Well, you can add them. There's no remove button. You can't uncheck it. You can't remove it from the task flow. So in order for you to remove an item from a task flow, you have to like delete the entire task and recreate it. If you had any details, like for example, descriptions, I do like the descriptions in the task flow. So you click on the task flow itself, and then you can actually click in the descriptions and write the descriptions piece there. You can add descriptions. You can add enhanced data around like what it means, what this portion of the code looks like. But when you have to remove something, you have to delete the whole card, and you lose all that. You have to start a brand new one and rewire it together. So to me, like, I'm going to make mistakes. The fact that you always think I'm always going to add things is a miss, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I do think they'll let you. I think they'll let you move it between different ones, but they won't let you actually like unattach something.
Somewhere there's some Microsoft engineer going, "I knew it." I've been saying,
it's in preview.
I think when it is in preview, but I think what you're highlighting is there are lots of tools out there now, right, that have task flow creation systems, right?
Yep.
And we're used to them.
Yep.
So base level functionality like this would be an assumption that, it works pretty seamlessly when I'm, interacting with this interface. Pin what you need to in the areas as opposed to re-shifting it all and, doing, because that's what if it's the whiteboard, right? It's gotta feel like the whiteboard, right?
Yes, correct.
And I think that's my impression is, as Game Changes the UI is, I'm trying to think about this as take a team, take a BI developer, and now they have to switch to this, or they're going to try to use this. Where would the complications lie? Not necessarily from the technical side, but from more the strategic side of now I have to use this. And yeah, there's almost an intimidation factor, I want to say, if you've only been dealing with the line item view, where and I know the templates are helpful, but more often than not, I think there's going to be more applications of, I'm going to take my existing workspace and now I have to pin it to the task flow, or now I have to basically kind of convert, in so many words, my existing workspace and all my artifacts to a task flow. Where do I start? And I think that can, almost with the whiteboard, that can sometimes be intimidating when you do have that white space. And with that ability to kind of modify or go, no, this is not what I want. It's very production wide use. Like, hey, we're going to build this task flow to use now. Not necessarily I'm experimenting, or I'm testing how this would look. What would this look like if I did X, Y, and Z? And I think that's going to need to be a really important aspect of the task flows. If I put this, no, that doesn't look good. And to your point, Mike, I need to be able to, just see what it looks like and to be able to modify. Not, I'm going to put it on here because that's what we're going to do, because I already have my whiteboard over here and I've already mapped it out. Like, to your point, if it's going to work like a whiteboard, let's really put that functionality in there.
I agree. There's just some, and I think those things will get worked out. I mean, that's the whole point of preview, is to get things in here and start starting. I do really like the feature of having the task flow in front of me and then being able to quickly click on a card in the task flow, and then you get a filtered list of all the items in that workspace that attach to that card. I think that is extremely helpful, and especially when your items or artifacts in a workspace become larger.
Yeah. And I think too, the really smart idea too, to not make task flows a different window, or like in a sense a different UI. It's, if I want to see my line items, I just simply drag and drop the scroll bar, so to speak. So I can expand taskbars. If I don't want to see my task flow, I can close it up, because I think to me, I'm looking at this from an adoption point of view. What's going to make task flows highly utilized and successful within an organization? And on the other side of this, on the same coin, or the other side of the coin, where would it lead to complications or clutterment, where people go, no, this is too much? And I think you need to keep a user interface that we've had for 9 years. We can't just expect people to all of a sudden just start, widely adopting this and completely go against what they've been doing. We know these things take time. I don't know what your thoughts about that are, but there's going to be some learning curve.
Many thoughts, which is, I guess, to shift the conversation a little bit as it relates to, implementing task flows and the best ways in which you can utilize them, right? And while was 100% on board, right? Like all of the top level features, these things, the simplification, all of this makes a ton of sense. Where I fell off the rail here a little bit, and I need to discuss is in the context of types of workspaces. Okay, because the thing I didn't innately understand at first in the announcement of this, and I can't find in documentation that it's only a current limitation, is that I am only allowed one task flow per workspace. So when I think in the context of workspaces, what are the types of workspaces we have in the ecosystem of Fabric and Power BI right now? Well, I have predominantly, probably, the mixed bag of business needs, right? Business units are doing their own thing. They've got a ton of different ways in which they connect to data, ETL, whether that's through data flows or Power Query within Power BI, and you get lineage through that, right? Like if it's just simple. But then we also have many, many different workspaces that have completely different types of ETL patterns. Some may be basic, some may be medallion, some may be like pick your mixed bag of all of the different types of artifacts that can and do exist within a workspace.
Sure.
And we have a bunch of artifacts now that help us manage all of that because it like folders, right? I've got a bunch of stuff. I need to organize it. In the context of this conversation now and Fabric, are we like this seems to be all of a sudden a new feature that comes front and center in workspace types of workspaces and how we organize workspaces within an organization? Because are we now going to say that, well, this workspace, everything in it abides by this sort of task flow because we would have to, wouldn't we?
And I think this is a good point where you can't expect clean, like in that every task flow is going to be nice and completely tidy. Like the templates are great, but the templates are great because they're already, in a sense, predefined. There's only those given items. And I think to your point, our workspaces, by virtue of what the workspaces have been to us, are not a single use case. They're not just this one instance flow of information. They're going to have multiple. And also, they're not the cleanest or not necessarily meant for task flows. A lot of our items, not everything in a workspace deserves to be in a task flow, but that doesn't mean it deserves to be deleted either. I think the biggest part that I really agree with is you're going to be dealing with a lot of non-templated situations. The majority of probably a lot of teams are not something that fits in a given template, or maybe the idea that a given task flow would be. So how does that look? Like, what is actually literally, how does that look? And how does that look in trying to apply that in a team?
I'm going to react to both these things, Seth. So I think you bring up an interesting point, Seth, because I think you're talking about a point here where it's fundamentally challenging us to really evaluate what's in the workspace. And does my one workspace with lots of different work streams, let's call them work streams for lack of a better term, right? A work stream. They could have many different work streams happening in the same workspace to serve something else. For example, you have a workspace that's doing a bunch of data engineering, right? Not every data engineering thing is going to be one single continuous line of tasks. There may be like multiple lines of tasks. I'm thinking a little bit like a pipeline. So in pipelines, sometimes I have many actions that are occurring they start and maybe they start together, but we might have 3 different starts and 3 different ends of the different task flows. So there's potential here for, the task flow screen to have multiple different pipelines altogether. And so I don't know what that means. It's at the end of the day, I think it maybe will add some confusion. I think you have to be able to be clear about what that looks like, because you potentially could have more things in there. The other thing,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Seth. Go ahead.
No, along those lines, and one of the things I haven't stress tested, right, is in a perfect world, I have all my artifacts align perfectly with the medallion architecture. In worlds where, in reality, where that doesn't work, or do we redesign the way we implement or architect things in workspaces? Does the task flow become this behemoth of the web of exploding pipeline things? Because they may come from a source, but then we're deviating off, and we have to be very careful about the naming, because it's kind of going to be this limited sources of objects and then explosion as it pertains to the outcomes, right? Because the reason I haven't figured this out in my mind yet is it's shifting in my mind what the intent of the workspace was initially, right? Workspaces were the consolidation of artifacts for a business unit, right? And in Power BI realms, it was super simple. Like, I'm going to create one for marketing. Here's for sales internal, whatever. It was just bucketizing the things that produce things for the business. As Fabric has introduced itself and brought in Power BI to that ecosystem, we obviously have different types of workspaces, right? Development, ETL, or it is the ETL workspace. It is this department, doing a bunch of work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm lost a little bit in that workspace discussion, right? Like, how do I design things if it's not for the intent of the final thing anymore? It's now I have to architect what I'm calling bucketing and naming things, because all of a sudden the bucket called the workspace is now the bucket, the task flow, right? Or how do we reshift the imagination of managing all of these pieces in the context of now what task flows allows us to do, right? Because if in my world, right, task flows, and maybe this is just what I would have to do, is take a mixed bag workspace, right, and see if I could build out a task flow that made sense, because 40% of it may be medallion, and then the other 30% may be basic, and then the other is just reporting. And does that work? Right? Does it still make sense in the very exciting, simplified way of everything now becomes really clean? Or is it just a visual representation of the normal challenge we have in managing items within a workspace?
There's a pertinent point you're saying, and my reaction's thinking about this on, if we're going to have the task flows as the be all end all, the golden calf, so to speak, then does that require us to think differently about workspaces? Do workspaces either need to be molded differently, where we have a different UI? Right now we have the ability to pin given workspaces, but to your point, if we're going to focus more on task flows the way they are now, that almost forces us to think about how we're building or how we're organizing content in a workspace differently.
Yeah. And I don't even, we'll get to Jack's question in a bit, but in the context of, where we're at, I guess my original assumption was that I was going to be able to have multiple task flows. Mm-hmm. Right. And I don't know whether or not that's the right answer, because if I had multiple task flows, rather right now, a task flow highlights all of the item artifacts within a workspace, right? Mm-hmm. But I'd almost want to have, that's the artifact, that you're a data source, you're an ETL piece, you're whatever, but I'd also like a task flow, right? Like, what thing do you belong to?
Right.
And a roll up or almost an index of, okay, you have 5 task flows in this workspace. 3 of them are medallion architecture, or actually you wouldn't even need it, right? You'd have your whatever your medallion architectures are. You'd have your basics, and then you'd have, whatever the other, things would be, your custom ones.
Mhm.
And I guess to some degree it's okay to have, but it's still restricting you, right? Like if I choose the medallion architecture, I'd have to do the full medallion architecture every time.
Nope. It's just an example to get things started. Like, so
no, I agree, but
you can delete them.
Whatever I would
them.
choose, if I would have a different way, a different pipeline, right?
Yeah,
like,
you just make another.
Would I just drop down a different task from the source and then like have a different pipeline?
Yeah, I don't. The examples they give you are just examples. You can delete any of the cards you want, and then what I would think. So what you're describing to me is when you're saying like, hey, I may have 3 different task flows that are patterns that I'm trying to occur in a workspace.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, I understand your point because there's literally, you only select one task flow from the little quick menu, right? So I may want to select the task flow for medallion architecture. I may want to select the task flow for streaming architecture, right? Those 2 task flows from the quick select menu doesn't give you those options like up front all the way at the beginning, right? You can't have both of them just appear. However, there's nothing stopping you from building them in the workspace and having 2 separate lines. Line 1 is the medallion architecture and line 2 is streaming architecture. And they don't have to interact with each other either. It's just a logical grouping method. So you can build your own additional cards or even take the existing cards and delete them. So, I mean, I think you could be flexible enough. I do think task flows is forcing us to be more metered with what's going in the workspace and like really evaluating. Having that high level architecture now says, do we really need this extra lake house? Do I really need reporting to live in this thing? Where I get hung up a bit more is I get hung up on the fact that a task flow feels like to me multiple workspaces, in my opinion. So so there's 2 audiences I think we're talking about here. There is the enterprise BI team, which I think in the enterprise team, you're using the workspace security boundary as a way of securing who's allowed to work on the data, who's not. This is why we talk about models in one workspace and thin reports in another.
Yeah.
The workspace is the security boundary, or at least one of them. So in lieu of that, when I think about a medallion architecture, I'm actually thinking about, a medallion architecture probably is about 3 different workspaces for me in the enterprise space. If I'm in the business unit or I'm in a small team of developers, I'm probably not as worried about having the clear delineation between all those different artifacts because it's a single team. We have all the things in one space. So if I think about task flows from like a smaller team development, great, they make a lot of sense. Totally makes sense. But when I zoom out to the enterprise level, I don't think task loads are going to be as impactful because the enterprise already understands the architecture and they're trying to build cross-connected workspace experiences, which I think task flows does not do a good job of explaining. You may have a medallion architecture, but you're going to go all the way through bronze, silver, and gold lake houses. You'll stop there and you'll build a whole new workspace for semantic models. And so there'll just be another workspace that's going to consume from gold. And that's strategic because of how you want to have people access those semantic models. And you may also build another workspace for reports because I'm going to distribute reports differently than I want to distribute the data sets, or give people access to build their own reports in a workspace, but not give them access to modify the semantic models. So I think at the enterprise level, it doesn't fit very well for me, but I think in a team where you are having multiple people work on the same stuff, it does fit.
And I honestly, this is a huge point because as you guys have been talking, I've been writing down what's my approach, the initial approach, starting with a blank task flow. Is it just data? Is it a project, or is it a lake house? If it's purely the data that we're trying to capture, that's multiple workspaces, right? If it's a project, that's probably multiple workspaces too. And if I were to take a lot of my existing diagrams and write lines dividing, how would I organize this? Most of them are going to be, Mike, to your point, in at least 2 workspaces, a dev or prod, even in the most basic example. And this is if we're going to confine based on the UI or the technical part of the task flow today, this forces you to think differently. It would have to, because it doesn't make sense.
And this is where Jack Irby's question becomes very poignant, which he's asked, can task flows within a workspace refer to other workspaces? And the answer is no.
Right.
Not that I'm aware of yet.
Right.
It would make sense if I could.
That's actually really tough.
It absolutely would make sense, especially in the case that you're talking about, Mike, where Fabric is pushing the bounds of all of the things we can do with data, which is pushing the bounds of how we think about workspaces and how we organize this environment. So even if from a security perspective, we're going to say, okay, it now makes a ton of sense for us to have our engineering teams manage these, dev, UAT works, prod data sources. Those data sources are then the source for all of our business units. It's great, but the outcome of my task flow is supporting a workspace. It's not supporting a report that exists in my own workspace, according to like how this is set up in preview. Now, like could that expand? I would say, well, in this ecosystem, in order to work across the many various ways in which the organization of all that data is happening in Fabric, because we're trying to manage it in that respect, either there's a recommendation that we don't manage it that way, or and does this change the conversation and say, well, we've given you folders, right? And all these things, it does belong in the same workspace, at least from an organizational perspective.
Yep.
But then we're challenged with, well, how do I manage the capacity around all of those different things? Because those different workspaces allowed me to break things out the way I wanted to.
Maybe.
This is big, because you're at basically our, not proposal here, but the way we're talking about this is you flip what in a workspace is, flips the task flow, the relationship, which would make more sense. There's a one-to-many relationship, so to speak, between a task flow and it's going to fall more workspaces. Seth, I don't know at this point whether or not, and maybe there's a roadmap features with the task flows where it's like, if task flows are just going to be one workspace, one task flow, I'm going to move everything into folders. That makes the most sense. I don't think I can answer that right now as much as I would like to, because I love the applications of a task flow, both from a collaboration, communication, and just design point of view. But the question then arises from what we're talking about. Are we too limited right now to, in a sense, mainstream this?
Well, and that's why I asked, I made the point I did at the beginning of the conversation, right? Yeah. A game changer to me is something that is widely adoptable right out of the gate. And I like task flows. I love what it's doing. I love what it could potentially bring, or does bring, for brand new implementations. But I do like the point of criticism I would have with some of the features that have been rolled out is it's leaning too much into brand new and not accounting for existing. And when you have a tool like Power BI that is the main driver for how people are even going to start to engage or want to engage now that it's part of Fabric, there are ecosystems that you're putting out there and you're turning on for half of a screen. My expectation would be that it works to simplify their lives as it is constructed. And there are a couple glaring things in this preview that are like, that don't do that, I don't think, which makes it not a game changer initially. Maybe it will in the future, or it's a technical doc that brings me onto the right understanding of like, how do I think about this net new world? But like, we were just thrown into, and we've talked about ad nauseum, all of the Fabric ecosystem and how do we manage this? And we're breaking things out into further and further and further workspaces. And all of a sudden now we're presented with a feature that brings simplification only in the same workspace. And it's like, wait a minute, like that doesn't, there's a cognitive dissonance here between like the solutions that we're trying to construct, the architectures that we're trying to build, and something that we all see a ton of value in, but doesn't align with the direction that everything was going. And that's where I back off a little bit. I'm like, okay, well, is this limitation taking it off the game changer thing? Absolutely. I hope it produces or goes down a path, or like we get some explanation around the use case of where can I apply it, or how does it address these other situations where I'm going to have a lot of different workspaces, or am I not thinking about it in the way that a task flow does encompass all of this, and the templates are that easy button, right? If you can build something net new, but in the world of brand new workspaces, it's just a matter of like, you would see this exploded task flow and you could still, get a lot of value out of seeing things visually.
So as we get near the end, I'm going to push back a little on some of the comments here, because I'm taking a step back and had the thought, would I do a training on this? If I were to put together a Fabric curriculum, would this be one of the training features? And I think it's an absolute yes, that I would put this together, because for us, especially for people who've been in the data engineering game like you two for a long time, sure, doesn't have all the bells and whistles. That makes a ton of sense. But for a lot of organizations or a lot of teams who are going to start with Fabric, they're not thinking medallion architecture, and that's going to take some time. They may just want their data in a lake house. I mean, I like you said, we can't give you a rate of what number of organizations or teams are that, but that's a lot. That's going to be a lot. Not everyone's starting with the full technical approach or the full expertise approach. They're going to be starting with, I just need to get my data in a lake house and I need to share that with people. And to start with, the task flow idea as the default UI makes a ton of sense. And one, I would start my training with that way. And two, if I was helping an organization adopt Fabric just from a basic to mid level, I can absolutely do that with one or two workspaces or with folders, and probably be very successful with that, or be successful adopting that. I don't think I would be severely limited. Yeah. Again, when we get to enterprise, when we get to teams who have been doing these types of projects for a long time, the limitations arise, the faults arise. But if we're trying to get people into Fabric, and we're trying to make sure that what we experienced, Mike, with 2 data flows in a workspace and we had 11 artifacts, that clutterment right away, right? We can solve a ton of use cases, basic to mid, with utilizing task flows, even as they are today.
All right. Well, first, many thoughts. You guys have been saying a lot of good things. I'm gonna rattle off a couple of questions. First thing I gotta pick on is clutterment. That's a great word.
Clutterment.
Yeah. Did I use that?
You used a word, clutterment. I literally wrote it down just now.
Okay, I'm gonna look that up.
I don't think it's actually a word. Sure. I think it's the act of being cluttered, I think, is how I would describe that word. So let me ask a couple questions, right? So one observation I've seen whenever I talk to people about Fabric, they're overwhelmed. There's so much going on. Doesn't matter who it is. There's so many pieces to Fabric. People don't know where to start. So I think on one hand, TaskFlows does a great job of giving some people an idea of what could be built inside Fabric. Because there's this thing streaming, and there's lake houses, and there's data engineering. Like, all this stuff is kind of gobbledygooked and kind of smushed together. Great. It's the single platform for everything. And I think this is a lens of like helping those users kind of quickly get an idea around, okay, and when you listen to Amir describe the feature, like on some of his posts around this, or when he was describing the videos, he says, this is a place where you can say, this is a common pattern you may want to use. Land the task flow first, and then fill up the artifacts with the things that you need. So I know I want a medallion architecture. I don't know how it's supposed to all be fit together. So here's the pattern I'm going to follow, and then I build the things after the fact. With that, I now think about, okay, well, who is this designed for? I think about if we talk about, another question that goes along with that very well is, when I build or I talk to customers about building workspaces, how often do I build a workspace with everything in it? I think it's very infrequent. Less than, 20% of the time, I'm actually saying suggest put everything in one space. So for that, from one reason there, I'm like, okay, well, this feature is limited in what I think I would teach on. Yes, it exists. Yes, it's interesting. However, when I start saying, who is this feature built for? If it's a business analyst, it's interesting. It maybe helps me a little bit. If I'm a data modeler, okay. I think the business analyst and the data modeler really likes the lineage view because they can say, this model, these reports. To me, that's a linkage that I care about. So if I had 10 models and I had 30 reports, I really don't care about the fact that there's 2 tasks, one for modeling and one for visualizing, or that's all in the same cart. Like, that doesn't help me. What I care about as the business analyst and data modeler would be which reports attach to which data sets.
Mm-hmm.
Then if I move over to data engineering, this feature feels a lot more relevant because now I do have multiple things that I'm trying to translate through. So if I built a separate workspace only for data engineering, I'm talking about loading data. That's a card. Then I'm talking about storing the information. That's a card. Then I'm talking about transforming it and then putting it back down into potentially a new data lake. So that's another card all by itself. So as I'm building the artifacts, to me, a lot of this feels very relevant for the data engineering space. And now add to that, streaming analytics. Now add to that Kusto databases. Now add to that all these other things that potentially could store stuff inside your workspaces. So to me, this architecture feels a lot more relevant in the data engineering space. Now, granted, maybe I build my bronze, silver medallion architecture in the workspace. I probably don't visualize the data inside that workspace. I may delete those 2 cards at the end and leave them and put them somewhere else if I was going to actually draw out the architecture. So from my standpoint, I would probably use this a lot more in data engineering. Data scientists, that one to me feels like so this is one of, I'm literally going through the personas that Microsoft says exist inside a workspace. Data scientists. I still don't think we have a compelling story. We know what they do. It's a bunch of black science magic stuff, and how their things or what they do to build stuff, it's all in notebooks, in my opinion. It's all notebook driven, and those notebooks potentially rely upon other notebooks and potentially have other pipelines. So maybe this also helps explain the architecture of what the data scientist is doing inside the workspace as well. But again, I see the impact for data scientists on this feature being minimal. I don't think it's not going to game change their workflow. So, all right. In lieu of all this clutterment that is occurring inside the workspace, I think, is this feature a game changer? And this is my final thoughts here, and we'll kind of wrap here. I think my final thoughts is, this feels like a game changer for a data engineer. For someone who's going to be building lots of artifacts and trying to move data through a medallion architecture or bringing in streaming data and static data, I think this is very helpful. Is it helpful for all the other personas that are showing up to Fabric? Minimal. I'm not going to say it's a game changer for a data analyst or data scientist. This feels very centered around the data engineer. All right, so that's my final thoughts on game. Yes, it's a game changer, but for a very specific persona. Maybe some new features will come to it that makes this a game changer for all personas, but for right now, I don't see it as being a game changer for everyone.
Yeah, I guess my final thoughts. I don't disagree with you in terms of the role where it's going to find the most applicability. Maybe, the thing that is I need to invest some more time in thinking about is how does this, or does it change the methods by which we were talking about creating workspaces, and just organizing that realm, because in many cases, even in data engineering, though, right, I can't have a single it would, if I said task flows were the thing for data engineering, and that was going to drive what was in the workspace, then everything in that workspace would align to that task flow. I think from the way I'm thinking through things, to make the most sense of organizing all of that information, which means at current state, I'm relegated to that capacity. Or I build another workspace that could potentially be the same task flow type thing, but then how does that manage and change how I go about architecting things? So, Mike, I'm kind of with you, but I'm not, because if it's for data engineers and you're not training or teaching it, is it really for data engineers yet? Or is it, we just haven't figured out how to implement it in the best way? So still, I'm not I'm definitely not putting in game changer at this point in time because the use cases don't seem completely aligned for all the roles. It does have a ton of potential in bringing clarity, and I think that's what drives the excitement around it. Be like, oh my gosh, like I have all of this stuff. How do I make sense out of it within a workspace? I think they're on the right track. Hopefully, some of the discussion today, either clarifies how I would go about implementing, or maybe some new features are added in the future. In any case, excited about it. Wouldn't put it in the game changer category quite yet.
No, for me, just real quick, I mean, even today, we know it's going to evolve and they're going to listen to the feedback. We know there's going to be other functionality that we're not aware of. But for me, even today, just taking it today, there's a lot of basic users who are getting started with Fabric, where this is, to them, will be a game changer. Maybe not universally applied, but to a lot of people having that UI, I have workspaces that I can utilize this in. There are a ton of applications of it today that I think a lot of people have with, again, the right template. I think like the biggest point here is the question is, if the functionality stays the same, will that force us to change our current workflow, our current way we approach workspaces and projects? Or is that something then becomes underutilized? But to me, there are a lot of applications today that we have that can absolutely utilize task flows. And if you have something basic, maybe approach the workspace or how you're building differently. So,
yeah, I think you make a good point, Tommy. The solo developer likes this.
yeah.
The team development, not quite sure yet.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think we're kind of saying the same thing.
Yes.
Really good discussion today. I think this really challenged a lot of my thoughts on what task flows is.
I do.
I don't know what this looks like in totality, but as we kind of wrap here, I'm thinking there is definitely some value in figuring out how does task flows works across workspaces. And right now, my biggest hang up is, why can't I remove an item from a stinking card? I don't.
Let's get there. Let's work on that.
Yeah, to me that's like low hanging fruit in like preview. Like I get we're in preview, fine. But before it goes GA, please let me remove an item from the workspace, or just
give me the whiteboard experience.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, when I click on a task, it should already pre-highlight all the items that are in the task that are from my workspace. And if I uncheck them, they should just be removed. Like it just be a check in, check out kind of thing on the task itself. I'm just befuddled. Like this is, someone just totally missed the feature on this one. I'm like, I just feel like this is such a basic thing that should have been added. And I'm like, I don't understand.
You know what we need? I want to take a picture of my whiteboard and put it on my
preview.
It's in preview.
I know. I get it. I get hung up on weird features. I guess I do. I know this is a weakness of myself. Anyways, that being said, thank you all very much for listening to this one. I hope everyone got some interesting information out of task flows, what they are, potentially how to use them. What does it look like for your organization? So I think, take it for what you will, but figure out what size organization are you? Are you an organization of a bunch of solo developers who are building their own things? Or are you an organization who's going to be sharing a lot of content across users and teams? So I think that will impact the influence or how game changer that the task flows will be. With that, we appreciate your ears. We know this has been a long run for you, so good job. You've made it through however far you're going. If you run fast or you run slow, nice work on the run. We congratulate you. Or biking. I've seen people. I've actually got a text message from someone said, "Don't always talk about runners. I bike, and so sometimes bikers listen to your podcast too." All right, fine. Runners and bikers, you're welcome. Hopefully this made your run go a little bit easier. With that, please share it with somebody else. If you enjoyed this episode, if you had fun with this, we really appreciate it. Oh, and I can't forget the commuters as well. I've had people say we commute and listen to it as well. So thank you, commuters, for listening. Hopefully traffic wasn't too bad and your blood pressure didn't rise too high. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
As Mike said, we appreciate your ears. I'm going to start using that now.
I like
you
that.
Can find us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. Do you have a question, an idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode? Head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. Finally, join us live on Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all of Power BI Tips social media channels.
Excellent. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.